30 games. That's how many I've played, finished and reviewed this year. I managed to keep a cadence of one review every 2 weeks, save for a single instance back in April where I missed one of my self-imposed deadlines. But the number of games or the regularity of my videos was not what this last year has been about. No, the theme of 2022 was that I restricted myself to only playing video games with female protagonists. Now my goal with this challenge wasn't overly specific when I set out to do this. Sure, it certainly was intended to say something about representation in gaming. If there was an abundance of games with female leads, it wouldn't be much of a challenge to only play these games exclusively. But I feel like saying look how few games have female protagonists in 2023 isn't that profound of an observation. And I realized that my approach to doing this was somewhat flawed from the very beginning. The first game that I reviewed this year, the one that actually gave me the idea to do this, was ironically not a game with a single female protagonist. It was Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which is a role-playing game that lets you choose your character's gender. And while I did play that game as a female character, as I tend to do in most games that let me choose my character's gender, it was still the catalyst to see if I could make it an entire year, with the added caveat of not going the easy route of just playing a bunch of games with character creators that let you make up your own character, including their gender. Steam's user tag system was certainly invaluable to this endeavor, since the tag female protagonist is one that gets used quite frequently, and therefore made it easy to create a dynamic collection of games I could use to search for titles. The system isn't perfect though. For one, it features multiple titles where your character's gender is determined by the player, so a bit of research was necessary before playing each game. And its database, being entirely fed by users, leaves it open to containing false information or precluded me from finding obscure games in my library that might have had female protagonists but went entirely ignored due to lacking said tag. But while I'm already discussing the tag, I find it interesting that gamers feel the need for such a tag to exist in the first place. It hints at the fact that seeing women represented as the heroes of stories is something that there's an audience for, even beyond some random nobody doing a self-imposed challenge. You don't see the opposing tag that labels games having male protagonists after all. It seems that men are still seen as the default in games where gender is applicable, and that's certainly represented in the overall number of games that I had access to for my challenge. Even if I were charitable and said that half of the games I own either fall into the category of having no protagonist at all or letting you choose their gender, and that all the games in this dynamic category are correctly labeled, the number of games in my library that have the tag female protagonist are in a sharp minority. What I'm glad about was that playing only female-led games didn't massively hinder me from finding either variety or quality. I played action games, puzzle games, stealth games, platformers, point-and-click adventures, horror games, first-person shooters, and even walking simulators. And while not every game I played was good, there were a few in there that I absolutely enjoyed and that I'm glad I checked out. And even the ones that I didn't like were at least passable and not something I outright hated, at least most of the time. Now here's where the crux of the matter comes into play. What can be learned from this exercise? Honestly, as the year was winding down and writing the script for this video became more and more urgent, I felt less and less confident in my ability to answer that question. Maybe this is due to my methodology. For one, I played games that seemed interesting to me personally. I didn't curate a list beforehand and gather data from a representative number of participants, so I can't claim any deep insight into player habits or whatever. I'm also not the type of gamer to chase trends and always play the newest releases. So my dataset wasn't just current-gen AAA releases that came out in the past 12 months. Had I stuck to just that sphere, even with the many remakes and remasters that seem to come out these days, I probably wouldn't have been able to fulfill my challenge given my personal gaming habits. So I was definitely in a privileged position to have access to over 2,000 games spanning multiple decades. However, you too have access to those games. Maybe you don't own them yet, but there is a wealth of games you can still buy and play on modern systems. And just because they're not part of the current zeitgeist and don't generate the freshest memes on Reddit or wherever you consume your information superhighway image macro based comedy doesn't mean that they're not worth playing. But again, what have I learned after seeing these virtual worlds through female eyes this year? Well, my struggle to find enough games that were interesting enough to be played in the first place seems to indicate that there's still too much of an imbalance when it comes to representation. Again, this can be somewhat chalked up to my methodology. While I say that I only played games with female protagonists, that's not strictly 100% accurate. With two exceptions, I did play games where the player characters were female, but the player character isn't always the only protagonist or even the protagonist in their story. In Observation, my role was that of the ship's computer, while in Republique it was made abundantly clear that my role was that of someone completely unseen and largely intangible in the plot. And these instances show a stark divide between player character and protagonist. Weren't Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite or Aerith in Final Fantasy VII as much protagonists as the characters we as players directly control? I think it's important to keep that in mind, even though it's still important to have proper representation regarding player characters, regardless of their status as protagonists. Now, I'm not here to bore you with the scientific research about why female protagonists are less common than male protagonists. There seem to be a variety of factors that influence this, from typical male psychology, being tricked by showing them scantily clad women on box art, or appealing to the power fantasies that male players apparently seem to seek out more than female players, to the assumptions made by executives and marketing professionals, etc. One aspect that I found interesting though is this idea that representation matters because you as a player need to be able to identify yourself with a protagonist. I've seen this argument a few times, the implication being that you can only do that if the protagonist and you share certain commonalities like gender, sexual preference, race, etc. And while I said earlier that I believe proper representation is important, it's not for this reason. I mean, hell, I just got done only playing as women for an entire year. And even before that, I played a couple of games with female leads before starting this challenge, even for this channel, so I never personally observed the bias within me that I tended to gravitate towards male protagonists simply because they're male. And for the record, I'm about as cis-het white male as it gets. As far as Western popular culture is concerned, I'm basically the default blank slate. I'm the free skin you get for your free-to-play online multiplayer game, but I never had a problem relating to my characters or enjoying the game less because of their gender. Maybe it's because I seem to have a somewhat differing view of what gender expression is than what's generally accepted. To me, the terms masculine and feminine seem entirely meaningless. I personally don't consider myself overly masculine by any definition of the term. Sure, I have certain traits and interests that align with what's popularly considered to be masculine, but I also eschew a lot of common traits in favor of some that are considered more feminine. To me, these words serve no purpose. They don't seem to arise out of objective facts for the most part and seem arbitrary at best and malicious at worst, in the sense that they serve only to divide us. But as a result, I don't care if the character I'm playing is representative of me personally. Now, I'm not oblivious to the fact that as someone who represents the default, I also get to enjoy the privilege of having plenty of stuff to choose from that represents me. And I'm not trying to discredit women or minorities when they ask for more representation. Again, I'm all for more variety and representation. I'm just trying to express here that this lack of representation doesn't seem to stem from a lack of relatability. Well-written, interesting characters are relatable regardless of their characteristics. And I'm not saying that most female characters are well-written, not at all. But I'm also not confident in claiming most male characters are either. As with everything, Sturgeon's law applies. If there's a takeaway from this exercise, it's that female protagonists are certainly still underrepresented in general, and that games can always benefit from a broader appeal, and that gamers need to show the industry that this can be profitable. If you watched this video and maybe followed my reviews over this past year and only experience games that reflect your own reality, especially if you fall into the same socioeconomic bracket as I do, you might want to make the deliberate choice to check out experiences that put you into the shoes of someone different from you. I played some great games in the last 12 months that I really enjoyed, and the lack of a penis on the protagonist never dampened my enjoyment. Also, speaking of great games, there won't be any ranking for the games I've played last year. I've come to the conclusion that doing a top 5 or top 10 list is pointless. It's boring content to produce, it's of questionable use to any audience at best, and honestly, art shouldn't be a competition. If you want a final statement on the games I've played, here are the ones I recommend, and here are the ones I don't, in alphabetical order. That way you can't infer which I liked best, because that honestly doesn't matter. If you want to know why I do or don't recommend them, you can watch the corresponding video on my channel. As for next year, I don't really have anything similar planned to this exercise. I certainly found the experience interesting, but I also ended up having to postpone playing a few games that I was interested in the meantime. So I'll probably get to those relatively soon. Though again, I also got to play a few games that I would have otherwise missed, so it balances itself out. I'm also not certain if I'll be keeping up my bi-weekly release schedule. Sometimes it was easy to line up videos and have a decent buffer zone, but there were a few instances where where I barely managed to hit the intended target date. And because some games take considerably longer to play than others, and I have a full-time job with extremely irregular working hours, and gaming isn't my only hobby, and, let's face it, with the view numbers I'm pulling in, I'm not making any money off this channel, deliberately so I might add. I've turned off all ads regardless of the fact that they wouldn't make me any money anyway. I'll probably revert back to my old habit of playing a game and releasing a review once I'm done, without a set deadline. I also have plans to produce some other content beyond game reviews at some point, so keep a lookout for that. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.